Robb, one of the things that your book is just spectacular on, I think, is the idea of leaky gut, how it relates to grains, how it relates to autoimmune diseases, and the idea of molecular mimicry. And is that particularly your forte, or is that Dr. Cordain, or where did that? Did you pick that up from him, or did you expand on that? And,
Gosh,
tell us about leaky gut. Tell us about how important that is, and tell us how that fits into this big picture.
I've definitely gone really far down the rabbit hole with the autoimmunity. When I was a research biochemist, I was in lipid metabolism research related to autoimmunity and cancer, more the autoimmune side. And then really all this stuff got on my radar because I was eating a high-carb, low-fat, vegan diet. Right now I'm probably about 175 pounds. At my low point, I was about 140 pounds. Had ulcerative colitis so bad that they wanted to do a bowel resection on me, and I was 26, 27 years old. I had high blood pressure, bad triglycerides, depression. I mean, I was a mess. And so it was really an act of desperation thinking about this kind of evolutionary biology approach to these things that got the paleo diet on my radar. And there was some research that talked about the defense mechanisms in grains and how those defense mechanisms could damage the gut, and that might be a possible, lead-in for autoimmunity and systemic inflammation. It's worth pointing out that in 2004, if you went into PubMed and put in intestinal permeability as a search term or leaky gut, you would get back about 400 returns. And up until very recently, and even still in some circles, you as a physician, if you even said leaky gut or intestinal permeability, your credibility was gone. I mean, if you wanted to commit career suicide, you said those terms and you were branded a charlatan and you were done. And now today, if you go, when I just checked a couple of days ago, you go into PubMed, you put in intestinal permeability, there's almost 12,000 citations. And this interface of the gut barrier, kind of separating self from non-self, is probably the hottest area of immunology research in the world. Alessio Fasano at the University of Maryland just got a $40 million grant to study this on the celiac side. And I believe the story with that is that there was this billionaire guy and his wife had been sick for 35 years and they had done everything under the sun. And I don't know if it was my book or Lauren Cordain's book, somebody threw them some sort of paleo type book. She went 100% gluten-free, and then also the additional removal of grains, which all these grains contain prolamines, which are these proline-rich proteins that are very difficult to digest and seem to be problematic with the gut. The woman transformed her life. A few weeks later, she was asymptomatic. She had had lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and all kinds of systemic inflammatory issues, and it's an N=1 anecdotal experiment, but it resulted in the University of Maryland getting, I think, the largest research grant that they've ever had. And it's an incredibly hot area of research, and it spans not just autoimmunity, but the full. I think that this gut permeability issue is the lead-in also for metabolic derangement in a lot of ways. If we have intestinal permeability and it irritates, that intestinal permeability irritates the innate immune system, the kind of simple immune system, then we see immediate response that is very, very similar to type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance. And there's some interesting gene sequencing now when we see macrophage upregulation, then we see an antagonizing effect on leptin. And it's immediate. Every first-year medical student learns about sepsis and the metabolic consequences of sepsis. Sepsis is metabolically indistinguishable from really poorly managed type 2 diabetes. You have sky-high blood lipids, you have super high blood glucose levels, but the liver is not picking up that signaling, and so the liver is still pumping out blood glucose, or pumping out glucose via gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. I mean, the normal signaling that keeps homeostatic parameters is just gone. And this is what's really intriguing to me about sepsis and this leaky gut element being perhaps the lead-in for metabolic derangement. it happens almost immediately. And when we start considering sleep, one night of sleep can induce a level of, one night of poor sleep can induce a state of essentially type 2 diabetes in an individual. And then as they sleep and they exercise, they can reverse some of that insulin resistance. But one of the first things that fails with sleep deprivation is intestinal barrier integrity. And so we immediately get lipopolysaccharide going into the blood, which then irritates the macrophages. The macrophages get irritated. They affect the SOC3 gene that influences leptin. And so this is something that we don't need high carbohydrate intake. We don't need weeks or months or years of abusive activity to induce type 2 diabetes and insulin resistant type stuff. So I really feel like that's a piece of it. But then on this other side of the spectrum, if we have intestinal barrier breakdown and then intact food particles or even parts of bacterial particles going into the system, then we have the adaptive immune system dealing with those constituents as if they were bacterial invaders or parasitic invaders, making antibodies to those proteins. And if the proteins that are being attacked look anything like proteins in our body, then we have this potential for molecular mimicry. And then depending on what that protein is and your own genetic factors, it may result in type 1 diabetes where we attack the pancreas. It may end up demyelinating the neurons in the brain with multiple sclerosis. So depending on what type of proteins are causing the problem, what your genetic factors are, then it may manifest in different autoimmune states. And then if the type of proteins or the gut permeability issues are irritating the innate immune system, then we end up with metabolic derangement. And so I see that thing as basically a spectrum, and usually you don't have one without the other. People who are metabolically broken tend to be at very high risk of autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, these kind of weird systemic inflammatory things that look a whole heck of a lot like autoimmunity, but maybe aren't 100% characterized as autoimmune. And then when folks are autoimmune, it's almost a given that they're going to be metabolically broken from that insulin resistance, leptin signaling standpoint.
Do we have some questions from our audience?
So you mentioned that sleep is definitely a contributing factor to the leaky gut syndrome. But go into the diet a little bit more for me and how you think that that contributes to the leaky gut syndrome.
You know,
there's paleo.
As far as paleo, anything that can cause intestinal barrier breakdown seems to be linked into autoimmune potential. So even things like alcohol, acetaminophen, Tylenol, there's a huge list of things that seem to have some sort of effect on the intestinal barrier function. But I always joke, keep poop where it belongs, and so you don't want intestinal contents in your person. And so anything that can cause that gut damage can then be a problem. And so when we look at grains and legumes in particular, grains probably even more so than legumes for a lot of people, in biology, everything either has thorns or horns or teeth or poison or something to defend itself. And it's kind of wacky to think about, but grains, if they didn't have a defense mechanism, they would just be eaten. It's a nice, dense little food source. And if we get a fruit and we eat it, like eat an apple, this is a biological strategy that I call get a little, give a little. And so the apple tree gives something in that it's got a nice, tasty fruit package that a critter's going to eat, and usually the seeds get eaten. And the seeds are encapsulated in this very difficult to digest coating. And it also, like in the case of apple seeds, they have cyanide and some other anti-predation chemicals that make it difficult to break them down and eat them or use them for energy. Because if that seed gets consumed, that's it. Biologically, that thing is done. And when we look at like corn or rice or wheat, the thing that we're eating is the reproductive structure. So they actually have proteins and lectins and phytates and protease inhibitors, all these things that help to protect that seed coat from being eaten. And if you do eat it, it causes some serious problems for the critter that ate it. Our modern corn feeding of cattle, the reason why we need to use antibiotics with cattle is that when you feed them corn, it gives them what's essentially ulcerative colitis. And it's a race against time to get the cattle fat enough to slaughter versus them dying from basically sepsis and ulcerative colitis type stuff. And I think it's just intriguing that, we don't feed cattle oil to get them overweight. We feed them corn, a high carbohydrate, rich medium.
Okay, so you're including oats and corn and all types of grain in there.
Yeah.
What about some of the refined products that are now used in protein bars, healthy food, like the isomaltol oligosaccharides that they're using as a replacement for the bulk? What's your feeling as far as those products?
So that's a great question. There's a whole other layer to this, which they call them FODMAPs. It's a different, usually some sort of a complex carbohydrate structure that changes the gut bacteria. And so, yeah, it's kind of, and some of that is good, but then we're also pretty clear that one of the ways that you can change intestinal permeability is changing the type of bacteria that you have growing. And there's some really interesting research that indicates people who are obese have completely different gut bacteria than people who are lean and metabolically healthy. And they've even done some wacky stuff of like taking the intestinal bacterial culture of the healthy person, put it in the obese person, and it makes them healthier, and then they've done opposite and it makes them unhealthy, which is kind of wacky stuff. But there are certain foods, and like beans are actually more problematic in this regard because of some of the carbohydrate structures that are in, just endemic in beans and stuff like that actually cause an overgrowth of like the vermiculocytes, I believe are what they called. So, and those actually then outcompete the other beneficial bacteria, and then we see some sort of systemic inflammation occurring out of that. So it starts getting really murky and complex. On the one hand, you've got a direct insult against the intestinal barrier, in the case of, say, like gliadin from wheat. But then on the other side, you've got carbohydrate products that may cause small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, and then that can then antagonize the intestinal barrier. And no matter how tight the intestinal barrier is, there's always some low bleed over of LPS, the lipopolysaccharide, into the system. That just happens no matter what. And our immune system is kind of at an equilibrium with that if everything's normal. But if you cause an overgrowth of the bacteria, then it can push more of that LPS through the intestinal barrier. And it's interesting, the lack of sleep is the main, when we have a lack of sleep, one of the main consequences of that is that our immune system does not prune back the intestinal bacteria the way that it normally does on a cyclic fashion. So you get an overgrowth of gut bacteria that leads into the systemic inflammation. And so that cycle happens on kind of a 24-hour clock where the bacteria tend to grow through the day and then they get pruned back over the night. And then if you don't sleep, that pruning back doesn't happen. And that's where we see some immediate systemic inflammation. And so these different food derivatives can be a big problem in that regard. And this is just like the Wild West with this stuff. Like, we don't know anything about this. It's really interesting, though, that we have something like 50 or 100 times more genetic information held in the gut contents, the gut bacteria, than what we have in our person. And it's clear that the gut endobiome, the interaction of the bacteria in our person and the way it interacts with our genome is huge. And it's probably going to be like the biggest, hottest area of research over the next 10, 20 years.
I got a question, Rob.
Yeah.
With the complexity of the science of this, I mean, for you, it's not probably that complex, or Dr. Greenwald. But I mean, how do we take this information and place it into context for firefighters and law enforcement, and really those that might be watching today? I mean, what would be your recommendation to us?
The propeller head stuff just goes out the window when we actually talk about application. I mean, we do this in our gym all the time. Very successfully. You just start with basic stuff. We have this kind of paleo diet template where you start with good proteins. You have some fruits and vegetables. Fruit may be very moderate if somebody is metabolically broken, and we may push things more towards kind of a ketogenic or a moderate protein, higher fat type diet. So the application is easy. And if we could just get people to buy in for 30 days, it's done. Like the hook sinks in deep. We don't have a lot of problem. Where the problem arises is before we get the person bought in, there's a lot of arms crossed, and we have to get into the propeller head stuff to be able to make a case for why we should do it. But really the most compelling reason for this is an N=1 experiment. We put somebody on this protocol, we improve their sleep, we get their vitamin D levels higher, we get a little bit maybe probiotics, and the results are shocking. They look, feel, and perform better. We track biomarkers of health and disease before, we track biomarkers of health and disease after, and it's as consistent as the sun coming up and going down. I mean, it just works like clockwork. So on the application side, it's pretty easy, and these guys have done a really amazing job of creating a metabolic screen so that if we need that kind of outside validation, I mean, when you see your pants fall off your fanny because you lost 6 inches off your waist in a month, and your blood pressure, well, the blood pressure, I guess, is getting a little metric, but you look in the mirror and you feel better. If you're doing jujitsu, your performance is great, but you're still kind of like, am I going to keel over and die from eating this way? And so then you look under the hood and you see these metabolic parameters look great. But that's a simple intervention. It's an inexpensive way of tracking the before and the after, and it's crystal clear how that stuff works. So yeah, and I knew that we were going to be, talking to police, fire, and so we've gone kind of, full propeller head on this. But I mean, the application side, you don't need to understand any of the science. The application is easy, and it's interesting. In our gym, we explain virtually none of the science to people. Like if you want to send people running out the door in droves, you start talking about this stuff, and it's like you'll have an empty gym in no time,
My point is I think, at least in our business, Tammy, that people want to engage in this, right? And so they're either doing it on their own, they're managing this on their own, they're following your literature and other people that are doing paleo. They may be doing it through a gym, okay? But I mean, really for me is, how do you get them to switch at, when you get to Skinnerian behavior modification, how do you get them to make that switch? I don't know if 30 days, the window that you use in your initial phase has something to do with that.
Yeah, it seems long enough to get buy-in, but not so long that people freak out and they're like, oh, I'm never going to be able to have a cookie again or something like that. And usually if we get that 30-day buy-in, then when people look back and they start reintroducing some of these problematic foods, they usually don't feel that good. And then they're kind of like, oh, I'm pretty good with the way that I'm eating. And then if they go to a family function or something, they can kick their heels up and have a little bit of booze. And it's not something to be approached in a religious fashion, in a just super cut and dry fashion. Like I think a way to fail this over the long haul is to be too rigid with it. When we do some work with the Naval Special Warfare and some of the special operations community, and these guys are uber, dot the I, cross the T, do everything to the nth degree. And so these guys will have no gluten at all, no wheat, oats or anything. And then they get deployed, and the first MRE that they eat, it gives them the trots for 5 days because their system is so pristine that they can't deal with it. And so for those guys, when I do talks in that community, I recommend that they keep maybe a cookie every couple of days, a beer every couple of days, just so that actually they've got a low level of inflammation, so that when they're in it, they're dug into a hillside, and the only thing that they're going to have is an MRE for the next 3 days, that they're okay with that. It doesn't totally crush them. But then the rest of the food that they're eating is much, much better. They're addressing sleep issues. They're taking some vitamin D to deal with the, how important that is for inflammation. But it's super easy stuff to do. And for those guys, I think that's a more, we talked before we started filming that I think the police generally have a much more difficult time relative to the military because you don't have as much support staff. You immediately are thrust back into the home environment. You go from basically mini deployment, being on shift, and then you're back in the home environment. But you usually cruising around, Reno, for example, you could find a joint with a rotisserie chicken and, grab an apple or something. So I think from some parts of what the police and fire are doing is more difficult because you don't have as much support as, say, like the military, and those lives are not as separated. But then on the other side, like the implementation side, I think it's pretty easy to track down the chow and stuff like that. I mean, I travel 30 weeks a year, and I'm able to largely stick to it. So, yeah.